What we're going to touch on today is the discussion, understanding the purpose of estimate plans, estimate execution plans, and a written basis of estimate. And then we will talk about systems and software. And if anything, we'll speed up through that section when we start getting close to our hard stop at 7:15. So, estimate plan. The plan can actually be a unique document for that particular proposal or project that you're working on, or it could actually be somewhat generic. So, before a few minutes ago, we were just talking about how for a large job that maintenance can't handle, they'll go through the regular phases, FEL 2 through 4. And if it's a smaller job like that, and particularly if it's going to a non-EPC company, but an engineering firm is going to design it on the side, put it out to bid. Someone like Cajun or Performance will bid on it, they're really a general contractor, mechanical type contractor. They'll win it. The estimate plan in that case will probably be generic that the companies are using because they're following a set path. And they know that the information is coming from an outside company, and the relationship there is more formal and not as interactive as if it were an EPC company and everybody's under the same umbrella. But as the jobs get bigger, more complicated, and particularly if you're dealing with an EPC company, the plans become more unique and they actually become more critical in the process. The person that writes it usually is going to be the lead estimator, or whatever pay grade they are. But the estimator isn't going to just write it in a vacuum. The lead estimator should assemble it, should receive some type of approval or nod from the estimating manager, and then go and work with the other management, whether it's project controls, the manager of procurement, the manager of subcontracts, the project manager, the construction manager, all the other management personnel that are interfacing in the proposal should be presented with this estimate plan, and they should agree to it. And the reason is because the estimate plan's outlining who's going to do what, and a lead estimator can't just assume that he or she's going to tell everyone else this is what you're going to do and they're just going to do it. They don't have that type of authority. Project manager does to some extent, but even the project manager is somewhat bound by the company's functional practices. And so there needs to be agreement across the board. And also, as we all know, we're all working in the professional world. If you don't go and obtain agreement from your counterparts, it's awful hard to hold their feet to the fire because their response is, I never agreed to that. So you don't expect it from me. So when is this estimate plan developed? It should, if an estimate is coming and everybody knows, it should be developed as early as possible. If you can, possibly before the kickoff meeting, but if not, as soon as possible after the kickoff meeting is over. The reason it'd be good to have it written before the project kickoff meeting, if possible, is that during that kickoff meeting, towards the end or somewhere in that meeting, you can then look at all the different disciplines and say, here's the plan, look over it. Do you agree with this? And you can talk about it. Maybe there's too much to read and agree on in one meeting, but you can at least get it in front of everybody. They have it, and there you can agree on some time period that everybody will respond to solidify that plan so it moves forward. Because basically the plan, whether or not it is the DOR or whether or not it is supplemental to the DOR, the division of responsibility or responsibility matrix, whatever you'd want to call it, it's all those two documents, if they both exist, are going to tell everybody, I'm responsible for getting this out to estimating or to another department that's going to give something estimating in a timely manner And so it should be a what and a when type of discussion. And it should include a table, a cover sheet, a table of contents, and then a lot of general details. And the details should be fairly extensive. So this is an actual sample of an execution plan. The general usually just talks about, who the client is, what the document number is, and so forth, and who signed off on it, its legitimacy. The project overview literally just is an extract from probably the engineering.
What's DFC stand for?
DFC, direct field cost.
Is this a plan that's presented for final funding decision, or is this the estimate to be worked for presentation of the final funding?
It is the plan to build the estimate for final funding. So what this plan will do is, like I was saying, it'll have the project overview here, talking about the project is, where it's located, who's involved, and whatever details they want to work in that's pertinent. The work breakdown structure will start discussing how we're going to break the job apart. It should line up with whatever project controls develops for the project, which should have been developed by project controls and project management, and how they want to manage the cost of the proposal or the project once, if and when it's awarded and won. But this will go through and identify the estimate class and accuracy, milestones around the estimate process, not just milestones of when estimating needs to deliver things, but milestones of when things are due to estimating. So because procurement's feeding cost to estimating, subcontracts is feeding cost to estimating, engineering's feeding scope documents, specs, lists, and quantities. If it's an EPC company, if it's a regular general contractor, then estimating is not going to receive hardly any quantities from engineering. They're going to have to develop them all on their own. They're going to have to do all the hard takeoff themselves, which is a primary difference between an EPC company and a general contractor that does not have engineering in-house.
Except the design build contracts. When the designer and the contractor are working together, then that's the way it works, I think.
Will the designer provide quantities to the general contractor?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, they are partners. It's a design build contract. They are partners.
Okay. That I personally haven't experienced. I know that now you're also talking building and highway, correct?
Infrastructure too. I did buildings 20, 30 years ago, but and I don't do highways, not in estimating. So it's infrastructure projects like water, wastewater treatment plants, railroad programs, that kind of stuff.
Okay. That's, most of my experience whenever we were, my time at Cajun, my time at Day and Zimmerman, Day and Zimmerman, we were really an EPC too. We, even though Brown and Root at the time was an EPC, we were it was old school, right? It was back in the early 90s, and we were still expected to do a lot of takeoff ourselves, which was good experience. But nowadays with Smart Plant 3D and all the technology we have, if you're part of an EPC, engineering's feeding you almost everything. But the companies like Performance and Excel and Cajun and Turner that don't have the in-house engineering, unlike what you're experiencing in the wastewater treatment and so forth, the engineers basically hand over the package and say, quantities are yours. That's your business, not ours. And they don't hand much over. Even if they have it in a 3D model, they'll give us mechanical equipment lists, they'll give us instrumentation lists, but that's more or less the extent of it. Items that have to be listed. Other than that, we have to figure it out on our own. And we spend hours and hours taking off isometrics, and we'll do a little bit of that in the classes to come. The DFC estimate methodology, what that is describing is how the estimating team is going to estimate the direct field costs. So, is it going to be, of course, that needs to align with the construction execution plan to some degree as well. So there needs to be dialogue between estimating and construction. But the difficulty there is construction usually is writing their plan while the estimate's being developed, while this has to be estimated first. So there's always a little give and take, right? The plan is basically saying what the intent is, and sometimes the intent changes as time passes, or they'll make an early decision at the beginning and say, we're going to subcontract E&I and the soft crafts and everything else we're going to self-perform. The estimate will move forward, trying to develop costs in that manner. If they change and they say, no, we're going to self-perform E&I also, well, then estimating will have to adjust as time goes by. But this is also going to describe whether or not they are going to apply production rates at a very detailed level, or they're going to roll it up and they're going to use modeling. Are they going to use ACE instead of another, which has a lot of built-in algorithms, or versus another program that requires more detailed effort? Are they going to use subcontract unit rates? And so it'll describe that process as they run through. And then the deliverables and responsibility, that's basically identifying what estimating is going to give out, what they're going to, the deliverables should look like when they're finished, and also talk about the deliverables that estimating is expecting from engineering and procurement and subcontracts and quality and so forth. Now the allowances, that section, we know that whether estimating is taking off the quantities or engineering provides the quantities, whoever generated the quantities needs to sit down with estimating, unless estimating did it themselves, and discuss how accurate they think they are. Is it an FEL2, FEL3, FEL4 effort? How complete was the model? How much did they know about that particular subject matter or topic? If there's, let's just say that we're talking with the concrete guys in engineering, and there's 5 different areas. 3 of the areas may be fairly well defined. 2 of the areas may still be questionable. They just haven't gotten to it yet. They're working from one end of the plant to the other. So they'll discuss those items, and we will agree on waste allowances to apply the quantities. And there's several different waste allowances that we'll actually talk about in one of the later classes. I think it'll be class 4 is when we'll discuss that. But those allowances will be applied to make up for items that they think are missing. And this is not contingency. They're what we call known unknowns. And basically it's going to plus up the quantities in some level, some manner. But again, we'll talk about that in class 4, I believe. Construction labor. That section will describe how they're going to build the wage rates. It'll talk about the crews and what the crew compositions look like, whether or not they're planning on going open shop or union, or maybe merit shop. Usually, from my experience, merit shop and open shop rates are very much the same. Union's quite a bit different. And then we'll move into staffing and indirect field costs. It'll talk about how they're planning on developing the costs and who they expect to help out with that. They're going to factor it, and we'll do a very detailed quoted effort. They're going to do something in between. And in going through each one of these, engineering and home office, that uses a different group, and they'll talk about how they're going to develop those costs. And that's primarily just labor with markups. The other cost items. Now this is going to be an area where, depending upon what you're estimating. So I know that you were saying a second ago that you're in infrastructure. I know we have a few people here that are building construction. We have some that are in industrial, some that are in residential. And so the summary sheets and how you break all your costs down probably are quite different. But if you remember the summary sheet that I showed last week, there's a middle section that's labeled other costs. And
Right.
that is where we capture typically, even in the industrial world, it's not consistent. I've just been fortunate enough that most of the companies I've been with have been reasonably consistent about it. So it makes it a little nicer, but I know I've encountered others that are very different. But the other costs are freight, vendor representation, or field technical assistance, whatever acronym you like to use, spare parts, and various insurances that apply. We usually some companies will put bonding and letters of credit in here. Others will put it down below in the markups with escalation contingency. Let me think. There's commissioning and startup. We usually place in other costs. So I know that some may think, well, commissioning startup's just an extension of the direct field costs. But most of the companies I've been with don't look at it that way, because most of our contracts are through mechanical completion. And I'm not sure how familiar everybody is with the concept of mechanical completion, pre-commissioning, commissioning, and startup. So for those of y'all that are really familiar with it, I'll apologize for saying what you already know, but I'll go ahead and talk about it briefly for those that aren't familiar with it. Once we get to mechanical completion, everything's physically installed, but that's it. It hasn't been, it's been tested, but not thoroughly tested. And it definitely hasn't been run in and ready to start cranking things up. So it's like when you first finish building a car motor, you don't just start hooking it up and cranking it. You have to install it in the car. You have to make sure all the fluids are right. You have to double check and make sure settings are right. Then you'll start the thing up and you'll let it run for a while. You won't put any force on it. You won't rev it up or anything. You just let it start up and let it idle for a while as you're burning in the bearings and so forth. And after you've done that for a while, you'll double check the oil and double check the refrigerant. And once you're satisfied that everything's functioning properly, then you'll take it out on the road and you'll still baby it for a while as you're running it in and it's breaking itself in. Kind of similar process with once you get the mechanical completion, it's just physically there and it should be complete, but it's not ready to really start. So now you're going to go back and in your commissioning phases, and you're starting to verify first fills, verify your coolants, verify your oils, verify your sealants, you're performing, some will perform loop checks before MC, so a lot will perform the loop checks during your commissioning time. And then you start actually running the motors, and you'll let the motors run for a while and just let the bearings set. You're flushing all the lines, and you're in the control room and you're working all the buttons in the control room, and you're cycling the control instrumentation that you control from the control room. The ones that are out in the field that are remote, and I can't really do anything about those. So you're just verifying, double checking everything. There's a term called pre-commissioning. And really, pre-commissioning it's not an official phase, but we all talk about it like it is. And really what pre-commissioning is it consists of the last steps of mechanical completion and the first steps of commissioning. And that may seem really confusing and kind of why even have it there. But
Isn't that the individual system testing? each piece by itself, you test it, make sure that it works by itself, make sure that all the wires are connected and so on before you run the whole facility together?
Partly. Technically, that's the commissioning. But what if you drew a little chart and you had a line or a block that said construction, and at the very end of it, it would have a line at it, and it would say mechanical completion, and that would be the end. That technically be the end of the construction part, and then the next you'd have another phase that would say commissioning, start and end, and you'd have another phase that says startup, start and finish. And that would be your three primary phases: mechanical completions, the gate that goes from construction into commissioning. Well, if you took like a semi-transparent phase and laid it over the last part of construction and the first part of commissioning, that little gray area would be your pre-commissioning, and it basically is the base. It consists of the basic testing that's finishing up the mechanical completion, and it's the initial first steps of checking fills and lubricating and running those tests that you're just talking about. So,
Right.
So once you start energizing your motors and energizing the systems to where you have power, you're now out of the pre-commissioning phase. All the pre-commissioning part of commissioning is all manual. You're rotating the motors, but you're rotating them by hand. And you're doing at the end of the construction, you're doing your if you are going to perform your loop checks during MC, it'll be in that pre-commissioning phase. So it's kind of a phase that doesn't exist, but it does. I hate to say it that way, but that's really what it is, because the definition of pre-commissioning is somewhat fluid between companies and it overlaps. And that's theoretically, you're supposed to hit MC. It's a hard date. You flip over into commissioning and you move on into a new way of doing things, but it never really happens that way. System by system, it's completed and gets turned over. So that whole gray area in there is the pre-commissioning, where you're meeting that MC mark and moving it into commissioning.
But they intentionally never mention it when we build schedules. We never mention pre-commissioning. We call it pre-commissioning, like if you're doing a water treatment plant or a wastewater treatment plant, but you never put it in there on fear of contractual issues afterwards.
Yes, yeah, that's a good point, because if you look at our schedules, you won't see pre-commissioning anywhere either. But there will be a write-up. There will actually be a write-up that talks about what pre-commissioning consists of somewhere in the documentation. And normally our contracts go through mechanical completion and pre-commissioning. And then we have to define what pre-commissioning is. And so based upon that definition, we may or may not be pulling some commissioning activities into our quote unquote mechanical completion milestone. I know
also when you get into the SIMOPS too, right? Because I do commissioning for us, and our EPC has the pre-commissioning. So we'll go MC, pre-commission, hand it to us, and then we'd start the commission, and then we start the SIMOPS with the simultaneous commissioning, pre-commissioning activities.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it as well. So, but I've been on contracts where we were responsible through commissioning, and then the client took the startup, and then I've been on contracts where we had it all the way through startup and to provisional acceptance. So it's really a contract by contract situation. However, the vast majority of our contracts end at mechanical completion, which includes that pre-commissioning portion, just as Stephen said a second ago. And so therefore, the commissioning and startup activities in our mind are other costs. That's a long explanation to say why it's down there. The other reason is normally when we have that break, we don't disappear. We still are there with a skeleton crew because we are providing support during commissioning and startup with some minor amount of crafts and supervision. And so that's where we capture those costs, is down there in other costs. Escalation, it's all forward-looking escalation. Any escalation that we apply that brings historical cost to current, that will be up in the DFC or the IFC. It'll be one of the other categories above it. And then we get to contingency. Contingency, we're going to talk about the 13th class of our semester, and we'll go into risk, cost risk, and event risk at that point.
Can I ask a question? Sorry to interrupt you. You said something about the escalation that goes to the DFC.
Yes, there's the escalation that this is talking about here is forward looking. So what we'll do is that all the costs in the DFC, the IFC, engineering and home office, and other costs, we'll accumulate all of that and we'll apply an escalation value to it based upon what it's composed of and when do we think the midpoint of their purchasing time period will be. So if you know you're going to start buying 6 months from now and you're going to finish a year later, well, that means you're buying from 6 months to a year and a half out. So your midpoint is a year. So we'll look at what the recommended escalation is for a year out from today and apply that escalation value. Because you know that, and it may be the midpoint of time's not the best. It's the midpoint of when the items are going to be purchased. No one really knows. We normally use time, but we're trying to figure out, if you buy the first half between a point in time and then the second half in a point in time, that point in time is an average, is the concept. And so we'll apply that average escalation rate to that particular category. We usually apply it separately to labor from material and then separately for subcontracts, because labor usually is less than material and subcontracts is a blend because it has labor and material in it. The escalation that I was talking about that's up above in other costs and in the IFC and in the DFC, that's escalation that we've applied to any historical pricing that we've used. So in other words, if I couldn't get a current quote for a temporary building, and I know that a year ago it leased for $2,500 a month, well, I'm going to plus that up probably 3.5%. Well, today more like 6%, because we're experiencing 7 to 10% inflation these days versus the 3.5 to 4 we used to incur year in and year out. But I'll apply that 6-ish% to that to bring it to current, so that it's representative of today's price. Then the escalation in 14 will take it into the future. So we're trying to create by the time you get down to escalation, everything below it is going to be in that markup section. And so from other costs above, that's what comprises the bare indicated total cost versus the indicated total cost. If that makes sense. I know I'm throwing out a lot of acronyms. So
no, I was following you.
Does anybody else have questions about what I've talked about at this point? Is one?
Yes, Mr. Whitman.
Yes.
I'm sorry, my brain went to sleep when you talked about 5 and 6. Can you just a quick overview of 5 and 6 again?
Oh, the milestone, the estimating.
Yeah, what is that estimate milestone?
The estimating milestones in this document here are going to outline dates that the estimate needs to be finishing. Well, let me give you a couple of examples. One of the dates will be the estimating kickoff date. Another one will be when engineering is supposed to deliver certain quantities, and when procurement is supposed to deliver certain pricing, and when subcontracts certain pricing. And then it'll say the estimate construction review will be this day, engineering review that day, peer review this day, project review that day, business management review the next day, delivers.
It's a schedule, basically.
It's a
That's what it is.
schedule. Yeah, it's a schedule of milestones that define the major activities of the estimate development.
So,
Same
so
thing.
we usually call that work plan that has a schedule tied to a work plan, which has certain deliverables, anticipated results tied
Yeah.
to that time. Okay,
Well,
I understand.
Same thing goes for the reviews too, right?
Right.
My
Yes.
understanding.
Yeah, we'll define. We'll list the reviews in here as well.
Just curious, in the EPC, because I have no experience at all with the EPC. Do you guys have like 30, 60, 90% estimates, DD estimate, CD estimate, that kind of stuff?
Well, it sort of the 30, 60, 90% plan model reviews are similar to that. As the engineering progresses, the model progresses with it. So as engineering hits a 30%, 60%, 90% completion mark, they'll go through a whole set of engineering document reviews, model reviews, interference reviews, all of that goes with it. Normally, that percent complete follows the FEL. You're not going to hit 90% FEL2. You'll hit 30%. In FEL3, you'll hit 60%. Maybe you might get to 90% at the end if you don't hit 90% in FEL4. So we're producing estimates that are following along the progression of engineering. The difference in the estimate is that as when we have very little engineering information, we are factoring and modeling our costs much more than we are whenever the engineering data is very detailed and we start going into a detailed quantity buildup. FEL2 usually has a class 4 estimate associated with it. FEL3 typically has a class 3 estimate associated with it in the early phases and has a class 2 estimate associated with it in the final stages. And then FEL4 is usually a class 2 estimate. And if you've already started construction and you're trying to check costs, you might even do an class 1 estimate in FEL4. What you're saying, the answer is yes, sort of, if I can put it that way, just due to the difference in the way it progresses. But I think what you're saying is that as the design progresses, you're doing estimates along with those phases.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Of engineering.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what's happened here, except for it all falls under the structure of FEL 1 through 5. And then the 30, 60, 90% complete checks are associated with each FEL phase. Anybody else have questions? That makes sense? Does that help you? Okay. And then late changes. The reason this line's in here is that inevitably there's change. The engineering never really stops. The engineer, as everybody knows, engineering is always being pressed to get stuff out soon. They can only speed up so fast. As estimators, we're always frustrated with them because they're always late on the deliverables, and we're always getting squeezed because our date doesn't ever move hardly. But we do our best to incorporate those changes as we go. But there are some changes that just come too late, and we can't work them in the details. So what we'll do is we'll create a separate number off to the side that represents that one change, and we plug it in that section right there. It's treated almost like a markup, but it's kind of out of scope. And it could be there could be 0 or there could be 15 or 20. It just depends on how rushed everything was. And then the benchmarking, we usually this is actually talking about how we benchmark items, whether or not we're using a third party or it's internal. But we'll discuss how we're going to benchmark things, because when we go to our reviews, we use a lot of metrics and benchmarking to analyze and measure everything we're doing. We're looking at labor hours per unit of measure, material cost per unit measure, quantities of bulks against equipment quantities. We're looking at lane factors, which is the ITC value against the equipment. We look at DFC versus IFC, and we try to chop it up every way we can to see if something doesn't look right. That will then drive us to go back and research what doesn't look right. And if everything falls in line, then we have a comfort feeling about it. It gives us some level of comfort that we're not, nothing's really showing up. And then the estimate exclusions, that's just the list of exclusions of whatever is not going to be addressed in the estimate or the estimate process. And that could be blank or it could be quite extensive, just depends on the circumstances. This is an example. It doesn't mean that every estimate execution plan looks like that, obviously, because some of y'all have talked about what you do and it's different. But I think the general concepts and general ideas are going to be similar in what you're defining. But the estimate execution plan basically is telling everybody this is how we're going to build the estimate, this is how we're going to execute the assembly of it, and this is what everybody owes us. And this is estimating talking. This is what everybody owes us to facilitate finishing that, because we don't do it all unless it's a high level factored number. So the basis of estimate, we use it in our execution plans could be anywhere from 3 to 35 pages, just depending on who's writing it, how big the job is, how complex it's going to be, and how routine the effort is. But the execution plan talks about how you're going to do it. The basis of estimate now defines how you actually did it. So, like I mentioned earlier, some things are actually being developed during the estimate assembly, construction execution plan, project execution plan. And so as those migrate, as those change and the estimates adjusting to that, that's going to drive a difference in between what was intended and what actually happened by the time you finish the estimate. But we will go back and we'll cover a lot of the same topics in an estimate, in a basis of estimate. And again, it depends on the structure. Whenever I was at Cajun, which is similar to Performance and Turner, and where they're focused on general contractor, we had a fairly standard and concise way that we developed our plans and our basis of estimate. And so our basis really focused more around what we included, what we excluded, and didn't talk much about the process because everybody knew what our process was. At Fluor, Black & Veatch, Brown & Root, and other similar companies where they're EPC, a lot more complicated process, we actually are writing about how everybody interacted, what we received, who provided what, and how it went. So kind of the results of what we talked about before. We were saying division of responsibility. This is what you should be doing. Then this one here talks about what everybody did. So we go through, and really don't have time to go through all of these in detail, but you can see we'll discuss each one of the disciplines. This is what we did to build up the quantities, how we applied the costs, anything unique, who provided the quantities. And in each one of these, we'll list qualifications, exclusions, and exceptions and clarifications in each section. As a general contractor at Cajun, we just had one massive section that was our qualifications, exclusions, exceptions, and clarifications. And then how we did it, we didn't write about that because we were smaller. Everybody pretty much knew. We were just trying to identify things that would affect our contract, and then we tried to get that into the contract. Here, this is being written not only to tell potentially the client what we did and how we did it, but also to tell management and all the other people how we did it, what we did it. Because now it's a much broader organization. Engineering's certain people in engineering want to know, procurement and contracts want to know, quality wants to know, and so forth. So we're defining all this, and plus this document here is a record of how it was actually developed. So we're bidding a $5 million or $10 million job. It's just focusing on the clarifications. Here, $200 million job, $2 billion job. We're going to be much more defined and talking about what we did and how we got there, so that if we win, we have a record and we can go back and make adjustments, because there will probably be a lot that's going to change, and we need to know how and why. Now, some of that may be proprietary, right? So every company, client, contractor, subcontractor, vendor, everybody has topics that are proprietary to themselves. So you might write one of these that talks about everything, and that's for internal use, and then you redact what is sensitive and proprietary out of it, and then that can go to the client, particularly if it's cost reimbursable. The client has all right to know under a circumstance where it's cost reimbursable. But you can see a lot of these topics are exactly the same as before, but this one's broken down a little more detail, where it's talking about discipline by discipline. The execution plan could as well. The main question, the key, when it comes to the qualifications in the basis of estimate, in my opinion, it's really important to have those identified, and so you can try to extract them and get those into the contract somehow, whether it's just a separate document that's referenced in the contract versus physically being added. Somehow get it into the contract so that the client knows what your inclusions, exclusions are. Because if you don't have them in the contract, you might still be able to process a change order, but you've really lost a lot of leverage to process a change order without them. I've seen this write clarifications like that, tell the client it's not in there. The client sends a contract, our management signs it. The client doesn't want any quals in the contract, touching the contract at all. Our management didn't do a good job of working what we told them wasn't in there. And so then at the end of the day, we just lost the money. It was just gone, even though we identified it up front. So it can really hurt you if it's not negotiated in monetarily somehow, or they're not included verbally somehow. So I want to spend a little bit, the time we have left, about 10 minutes left, I want to spend that talking about the system to some degree. What this section is, and you'll see this in a month. Is there a question? Nope. What I'm talking about here is that there's a difference between proposals and bids. And there's a fair amount of confusion at times about, well, is this a bid or is it a proposal? And typically bids, if you go to a vendor and the vendor is giving you a price for a skid, that's really a bid. But if you go to a contractor or someone that's giving you a cost associated with the service that has labor and material and supervision and a schedule involved, that's a proposal. I know we call them bids anyway, but just to keep things consistent, because usually if it's on a proposal, it goes into your subcontract column. If it comes in on a bid, it goes into the material column. If you're purchasing it on a PO, it normally goes into your material column. If you're purchasing it on a contract, it goes into the subcontract column. So I'm working to try to keep terminology and mindset consistent here, even though I'm kind of kicking against the goads, because even I turn around and then we'll call it a bid, even though I know I'm talking about a proposal. So I'm my own worst enemy at times. So that's the main point I want to get with that topic here. When I've talked about a class 1 estimate, usually the class 1 estimates are a check estimate. You could do a class 2 check estimate if you want, maybe even a class 3, but the higher level the check estimate, the less accurate the estimate's going to be. And normally you're doing a check estimate because you have an earlier estimate that you're trying to check. So it doesn't mean it's illogical to do a class 4 check estimate. It's like, well, that's less accurate than the one you're trying to check. So what good is it? But the point is that they are a specifically unique estimate in that a lot of check estimates have actual costs in them. So in other words, you have a project, the project's 25% complete. Management's looking at it and it seems like, hey, it looks like we're derailing here. It looks like we're going in a bad direction. Our project controls folks are forecasting a negative future. Where are we really? And they'll bring in an estimating team and they'll work through it again. They'll bring in engineering, and engineering will try to forecast the remaining work that's yet to be done. And so, but in that process, if you're 25% complete, you'll incorporate all the existing committed costs, those that have been paid and those that are committed both. Calculate that and try to identify what's left and put together an estimate for what's left. And then that becomes a check estimate. And normally everybody wants that check estimate to be better than a plus or minus 10. They want it to be plus or minus 5 or 7 or 3 or something, which is very difficult to achieve. However, if you think about it this way, if you have a job that you're 50% through and 50% of your cost is it's incurred, it's actuals. So it's got a plus or minus 0 on it. And then the second half, you've got enough detailed information that you are putting together a plus or minus 10. Well, by definition, you're plus or minus 5 because half's plus or minus 10, half is plus or minus 0. The average is plus or minus 5. It's very difficult to actually estimate better than plus or minus 10. And I know people will go, oh, sure we can. I've been doing it for 30 something years and it's just it's hard. It's near impossible to do better than that unless you have one of those kind of circumstances where you've got axles in there that are starting to reduce it and you were able to make plus or minus 10 on what you were looking at going forward.
Quick question.
Yes.
When you say estimates are converted into budgets, I'm assuming that somebody in management is going to say, I'm going to take 5% off. That's my profit, or 10% or whatever the number is. The rest is your budget to finish the job. And the less you can do, the better for you for bonuses or whatever. That's the way it used to work for contractors in my side of the world.
Yeah. Whenever they convert it,
but it can be the same number. That's my point. It can be the same number.
Bottom line, our number would be the same in a lot of cases. However, when we estimate it, our fee, our project gross margin is at the very bottom. So when they convert the top into the budget's bare. So our project cost experts, they have the PGM over to the side anyway, and they're watching it and they're predicting whether it's going up or down all the time. So what you said is actually what we're doing, but our work process has it separated before we even start anyway. And so one of the main reasons I talk about the conversion, and we get to that later, is that even though it's the same number, same scope, doesn't mean they're all together the same. But I think we talk about that on 12th, 13th, or 14th class. We'll go into more detail. Estimating software. I want to touch on this to some degree. There's a lot of variety out there, and doing what, we've got a lot of different experience in our class here. So if you're doing infrastructure, you might be using heavy bid. If you're doing building construction or residential, you might be using Timberline or another program like Timberline. We use a little bit of everything. But there's one program out there that's particularly savvy when it comes to our work, but it's really good for FEL2 and early FEL3 work. It becomes less and less helpful as we get into latter, more finished FEL3 and FEL4 work, because now when we get into the detailed FEL3 and in the FEL4 estimates, which are a type class 3 and a class 2 estimate, we're dealing with a lot of details, and we're laboring those details, and we're pricing those details, and we're using a lot of quotes, and we're being very specific. So that program doesn't work so well. A program like Timberline works better. But there's a number of things to think about when it comes to the software programs. And that is, if any of y'all are familiar with Timberline or programs like it, when you first open up the box, the program is empty. There's nothing in it. It's a shell. You have to buy the database, or you have to build your own, one of the two. And now I'm a proponent of Timberline. If I'm going to be forced to use a program, Timberline's one of my preferable programs, honestly, because you can build assemblies in it, and you can actually move yourself into a parametric type estimating process if you do stuff that's fairly repetitive. It's a pretty strong program from that standpoint, but it takes hours and hours and hours to build those assemblies unless you buy them. But the problem is, if you go buy somebody else's database, you go buy somebody else's assemblies, now you're just estimating what somebody else built. So you still have to go back and tweak them and adjust them to your approach. Because if you don't, you aren't estimating your methodology. You're estimating somebody else's methodology. But the company that uses, when they choose a software, they need to be thinking about, what is it capable of? Does it match how we do work? Does it match what our industry requires? And what's it going to cost? Because I when I joined one of my companies, they basically said, we have estimators all over the company in our division, but we're not a department. They're just estimators out there kind of just working with whoever. And they wanted me to bring it together and make a department out of it. And then they said, we're going to start using WinEst. We decided that's a program we want to use. When I interviewed with them and I hired on with them, they told me it was going to be Timberline. But I had a 2-month gap between when I interviewed and accepted and when I started. And the day I walked in the door, they said, oh, by the way, it's WinEst, not Timberline. I'm like, oh, great. Okay. Don't know anything about WinEst, but I guess I'll learn. So one of the things we found out is that WinEst, at least back then, they have a closed architecture. Timberline, you can load and modify your database at your own will. WinEst wouldn't let you do it. You had to download it, send the file to them. They would unlock it, send it back. You would then update everything you wanted, send it back. They would then archive it and send it back, and you loaded it back into your computer system. And they would charge you about $1,500 every time you wanted to do that. So I was like, I'm not in favor of this at all, because I thought Timberline was a better program and they didn't charge us to maintain it. So, everybody's got to think about, what's the system capable of? Can you build really fancy, complicated assemblies or not? And how much is it going to cost me day to day or month to month? And then, do I have anybody that's knowledgeable in this program? Because if you've got a really slick program and no one knows how to work it, you're in a lot of trouble. Main point is that I'm a real big proponent of Excel. I like to program. I don't program in BASIC or anything like that, but I used to, but I've forgotten. But I like to build a lot of complicated or semi-complicated formulas and make it as automated as possible. And I found that it's less expensive than all those other programs, and I can make it function very similar. It doesn't look quite as slick, but it functions very much the same, and it costs less money, and it's more flexible. But a lot of companies are like, nope, Excel kills you. Excel's got to go. We just bought a system. Go use the system. and everything's going to be great now. And what they didn't stop and realize is that garbage in is garbage out. It doesn't matter if it's canned, doesn't matter if you bought a really slick database. If you got people that are just putting stuff in, then just stuff's going to come out. It doesn't matter. And if you got people that are operating the system and they don't know really how to operate it, it's still junk coming out. You might as well stuck with Excel. You can still have key punch errors in a canned program, just like Excel. It's just you won't blow the formulas out. That's the key. That's the
And
main.
you know what, Professor? That's the problem, especially when the organization gets bigger. The person who's making the decision of buying the software is 1,000 miles away from you, or maybe more than 1,000 miles. In my case, probably 10,000 miles away from me, and
Yeah.
he is deciding to things that he. And remember, most of the time, those who make the software decision don't have what we call boots on the ground experience. They
Yes.
just technology people, and it looks cute. Let's buy it.
That and even worse, they may be the ones that were taken out to some fancy golf tournaments at a nice
Yes.
coast,
Yes.
and they're like, "This is the program. These are the people." You end up inheriting a program for that reason. The program that I talked about that has algorithms in it that's very, very good for is Aspatec Capital Cost Estimator. I think I mentioned it last week. It can do engineering calculations. It's really tremendous, but it can be overused when you start getting in detail stuff. I'm hearing good things about Cleopatra, but I don't know anything about it other than just people saying, "Yeah, it's been really good. We found it, to be decent." I don't know that it's better than Timberline, but my understanding is it's better than WinEst. MC Square is now gone. US Cost Estimator is now gone. I've heard that RIB has bought them and absorbed algorithms out of them and merged it into their updated RIB. Heavy Bid, I understand, is pretty good for infrastructure, but it's not really doesn't handle pulp and petrochemical type stuff very well. So, and I've messed with it, but I haven't actually been taught how to use it. So there's a lot, and every time I go out there and search, there are more and more and more programs showing up all the time. And everything I've listed here is really building construction and heavy civil or petrochemical type. They're not so much residential. I think there's a number of unique ones that are fit for residential out there. So that I'd be curious to see how those function and what they have in them as well. But that's it. I'll shut it off. We've eaten up 5 minutes of the quiz time. If anybody has any questions, if y'all want to stay on and ask a question, I'll go and answer that. But other than that, everybody can go and take the quiz over again and book this time.
Mr. Whitman, it's not letting us take the quiz over again. Since we've already taken it once, I believe you only have one attempt on it. So if we've taken it before, we're not able to take it again.
All right. Well, let me fix that then.
Can I ask you a question, Professor Whitman? Do I need to take the quiz again?
Yeah,
I got 79. I mean, I'm not happy with it, but I don't want to take it again. Sorry.
Yeah, no, it's up to you. If you don't want to, you can stay with what you have. It's purely up to y'all. I'm just giving everybody a second chance.
Mr. Whitman, is the test the same test or a different test?
It's the exact same test.
Okay.
All
So,
right.
Professor Whitman, I do have a question for you.
Yes.
So, when you were going through the estimate execution plan and the basis of estimate, I was noticing that in the table of contents, it talks about commissioning and startup just in the BOE. So, there are going to be times that there will be commissioning and startup discussions in the estimate execution plan, just for clarification.
Yes.
Okay.
If you know that you're responsible for it, contractually they're asking for it, you will discuss it then. Or if you know that you're going to provide support but not actually be responsible for it, you'll talk about it that way as well.
Gotcha. Okay. Thanks for the clarification.
No, you're welcome. Anybody else? Otherwise, I'll drop off, but I don't want to drop off and if anybody has a question. Thanks, y'all. Have a great evening.